Hello, everybody. Welcome to this revision session on the end of the Cold War. The second part of that, anyway, we are going to do from Reagan and the Cold War, Gorbachev's new thinking, to the end of the Cold War itself. So let us begin. The Second Cold War is called so, even though the First Cold War hadn't technically ended. Because it came after that period of détente. And whilst détente wasn't the end of the Cold War, there was a relative peace between the two countries, and they were actually making agreements like SALT and the handshake in space, and the two leaders were meeting each other more often. But because of Afghanistan, that had ended, and the Olympic boycotts had taken place, and therefore there was a renewed threat of nuclear war, as can be seen in some of the films that were made at the time. There's two here, one from America the day after and one from Britain called Threads, which is where my hometown of Sheffield was bombed, and you can see the that happens, scaring the bejesus out of people who watched it, to be honest. Again, not since the Cuban Missile Crisis had people been so worried. If you want to watch them, they are on YouTube, at least Threads is, or the bit where the bomb happens is, just type in Threads. And these happened in 1983 and 1984, so you can see when the Cold War, Second Cold War, had clearly begun. What did these films show about how people felt about the possibility of nuclear war in the early 80s? That it was a distinct possibility again. Now, at this point, Ronnie Reagan, the cowboy actor from Hollywood, had actually become president, and he'd become president because he was more hawkish and more tough, and promising more tough on communism. He called the USSR the evil empire, and he wanted to make America feel better after losing in Vietnam and being humiliated in Iran when the Shah took over and expelled all the American diplomats. So what did he do? He announced that they'd be spending more than $1 trillion on defense between 1981 and 1987. And by defense, it means offensive weapons, but you call it defense to protect yourself, because nobody says that they're going to go and start a nuclear war. But so it's on weapons. If you see defense spending on defense spending, it means weapons. This included 100 MX missiles, neutron bombs, stealth bombers, Trident submarines, some of which were sold to Britain, and cruise missiles which were stationed in Europe, including at Greenham Common in England as well. So cruise missiles are different to ballistic missiles in that ballistic missiles are fired up in the air, and then gravity does the rest, bringing them back down. So you can spot them quite easily with radar, and you have to be pretty accurate with the way that you send them up. Cruise missiles are like a plane, essentially a missile with a plane's engine on the back, and it can fly flat across the land, which means it's more difficult to spot. And there was even more spending and more weapons than this. These are just a few examples that you could use. So the impact of Reagan's defense policy. One was that they could attack enemy missiles instead of cities and wipe out the threat of the Russian nuclear weapons. That's called NUT, Nuclear Utilization Target Selection, and then it would mean the end of mutually assured destruction. All right, because now there's less chance that the Russians can send weapons back, and therefore America would have the advantage and wouldn't necessarily be destroyed themselves if they're outgunned and out-technologied the Russians, they might feasibly win a nuclear war rather than everybody losing. So you can see where the cruise missiles were stationed in the different countries and where the Pershing missiles were stationed, and you can also see where the Soviet bases were, where their missile bases were. Okay, it's the same thing. The zero option. The zero option was something that Reagan came up with because he knew that he had got more money and more money to spend on weapons. So he proposed this zero option to say we will not put any intermediate range missiles in Western Europe if you take away your SS-20 missiles, which you saw were there. Brezhnev, who is still leader of the Soviet Union at the time, said no, because he doesn't want to appear weak to his people by saying, I will take away my missiles and decommission them. America will still have them, they just won't be in Europe, whereas Russia are going to dismantle them. Reagan probably knew that he wasn't going to get no as an answer, but by pushing Brezhnev into refusing the zero option, America have got the moral high ground to say, okay, we offered you some decommissioning and you didn't take it, so we're going to put even more missiles in there. And in a speech to the House of Commons, in Parliament in this country, Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, to which the leader then, after Brezhnev had died, called him insane and a liar. So the evil empire speech, you can watch him make the speech on YouTube if you just type in Reagan's evil empire speech. But basically, he said this a number of years ago. I'm not going to do the accent. Nobody deserves that. I heard a young father give a speech in which he said, "I love my I'm going to do the accent. I love my little girls more than anything." He went on, I would rather see my little girls die now, still believing in God, than have them grow up under communism and one day die no longer believing in God. This is why I shouldn't have done the accent. There were thousands of young people in that audience. They came to their feet with shouts of joy. They had instantly recognized the profound truth in what he had said. Let's just think of what he said. He said he'd rather his girls die than grow up under communism. And I guess if you're ultra religious, then kind of makes sense, but really? You'd rather your kids die? Okay. It is going to increase tension, isn't it? It's calling them an evil empire. It's saying that they are worse. Communism's worse than the death of your children. Okay, Ronnie, really? Fair enough. So it shows Reagan's attitude towards communism and how much he hates it. Meanwhile, in Poland, there is a movement, a trade union movement called Solidarity, which is resisting communism and being given assistance by America, which the Soviets know. And because the Poland is a communist satellite state, the Soviets walk out of the renewed Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty or start talks in 1983. And then we get Star Wars, not the film, although it's clearly named after the film, which has just been released, or at least the final one, Return of the Jedi, has just been released. And because it involves lasers in space, some bright spark in some newspaper somewhere said, oh, it's like Star Wars. And that's what it became nicknamed. But if you want to write it in the exam, just call it SDI. It's less letters and Star Wars. It's much easier. And so it was what the Americans alleged that they could do to stop Russian missiles from getting to America, because they would have to send them into orbit to reach America, the intercontinental ballistic missiles. And they said, right, we can shoot them down by using mirrors on satellites, which will how does it work? It's nuclear missiles launch, satellite detects launch. The laser beam is directed at the satellite. The beam is reflected to one of the many battle satellites. The beam is directed at a missile, and the laser beam destroys the missile. Now, not going to lie, it was rubbish. It wouldn't have been rubbish if it worked, but it was never going to work, and it never did work. But it's a nice idea, and the Russians believed it. So that's all that you needed to know. So there we go. Early warning satellite after missile is sends a message ground-based laser, which relays it to mirror it in the stationary orbit, and on some battle mirror in low fast orbit, and then missiles destroyed, but not really. So it wasn't ready, and never actually was. But Reagan was so confident, the Soviet Union were like, "Oh my God, this changes everything." And it would mean that they could not attack make a nuclear attack on America, but the USA could not attack the Soviet Union, completely negating mutually assured destruction. And all that money that they spent on making nuclear missiles would be useless if they knew they were going to be shot down before they would actually explode on America. And they knew that it couldn't afford to build its own version of SDI. And well, the Americans couldn't build a version of SDI. But the Russians were tricked into thinking that they had, and that Russia couldn't do it. And so it had to start thinking about maybe giving in to the Americans. So think about SDI when it comes up, and why set up, what it was, and what the Soviet reaction to SDI was, but what the importance of the SDI was for United States-Soviet relations. It was a turning point because mutually assured destruction would become obsolete. It altered the balance of power between the two superpowers because the Russians were not rich enough or scientifically advanced enough to continue competing against America in the nuclear arms race. So therefore, it actually improved superpower relations because it meant that Gorbachev, who's the next leader of the Soviet Union, decided that he would reduce spending on weapons, and it meant there was more cooperation, meaning that Gorbachev was more likely to talk to Reagan, which he did, and bring about the abandonment of the Brezhnev doctrine, which would ensure that the satellite states were defended, and also it led to the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. So that was Reagan, the Second Cold War, and the SDI. Here is what happened when Reagan and Gorbachev met, his new thinking, and some of the summits that they met at. So it's important to realize why Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union and what was different about him to the other leaders preceding him. Now, Brezhnev had been in power for a long time, as you can see, 18 years pretty much, and he died in November 1982. And Andropov took over, didn't last long, he died. Chernenko took over, didn't last long, he died. Now, why was that? It's not because somebody was murdering them, it's because they were old men, right? To get to become leader of Russia, you had to have been around the block a few times. And that meant that by the time you got to become leader, you were getting on a bit. So you're more likely to die. Gorbachev, on the other hand, he doesn't look young, to be fair, but he was relatively young in his 50s compared to the old 70, 80-year-old men that preceded him. And he had a different way of thinking to them. Now, this is the hairy, baldy theory of Russian leaders, that you get one that's got lots of hair, full head of hair, and then a slightly balding one, a hairy one, then a balding one, which Putin's kind of wrecked that because he's been in charge for so long. Anyway, not really about Putin. So came leader in 1985, and the USSR slowly began to reform. He's never going to get away with changing everything immediately, but he brings new ideas to the table because he is young, dynamic thinking, and he realizes that they can't keep up with America. Initially, as you would, did not like Reagan, called him a caveman, thought he was a bit backwards, but then Gorbachev softened his attitude, partly because the Soviet Union was losing money hand over fist, mainly by spending it on nuclear weapons. That meant that living standards in the Soviet Union were incredibly low. People were very, very poor and hungry. We've talked about solidarity in Poland, which meant that Poland declared martial law where the army were in charge. The leaders changing hands very, very quickly, one after the other, meant there was a lack of stability. And there was also increasing unrest in other satellite states because they were poor, just like the Soviet Union. And the only thing that was keeping communist governments in power was the oppressive regimes controlled by the secret police in the different countries. For example, the Stasi in the East German Communist Republic. Another symptom of this backwardsness of Russia, this lack of money and lack of technological advancement, is the Chernobyl disaster, where there was a reactor that exploded, almost threatening the world, to be honest with you. But it laid bare the fact that Russia hadn't really been keeping up to date with their technology, and was very embarrassing for Gorbachev and the whole Soviet Union. So he said, do I do the accent? No, I'm not going to. We can't go on living like this. And he came up with a new way of thinking. So it's called Gorbachev's New Thinking. And there's 4 parts to it. And the first 2 have got Russian names. One is Perestroika, which is Russian for reconstruction, which means the economy was reorganized, allowing some selected parts of capitalism into the economy. So some private enterprise, some global companies, and McDonald's in Moscow is the best example. Google that if you want to laugh at the Russians tasting McDonald's for the first time. And the second one is glasnost, which means openness and transparency, and that you might be able to say things that you weren't able to say before and not get arrested. I used to hear these 2 on TV when I was young all the time, glasnost and perestroika. I had no idea what they were because I was about 8 or 9 at the time, but that's what they were talking about, that Gorbachev was starting to ease up a little bit. Policy number 3 was the end of the Brezhnev doctrine, and that they didn't necessarily need to have the influence over these countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary anymore, and that they could go and do their own thing. And then policy 4 was reducing the size of the military, including nuclear weapons, but also the amount of soldiers fighting in Afghanistan, because that would save a lot of money as well. Now, Reagan and Gorbachev didn't start out on the greatest footing. Reagan, very anti-communist, but as soon as he realised that Gorbachev was willing to think in a different way, he immediately decided that that was worth investigating and pursuing, and changed his ideas from let's all hate on communism to let's actually talk to them, which was a good thing to do. The other person involved in this relationship was Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister at the time, who actually was very, very close politically and personally to Ronald Reagan. and actually got on quite well with Gorbachev as well. Said, "I can do business with Mr. Gorbachev," in a famous interview. And here's all the time that Maggie and Ronnie were pictured together having a lot of fun. Seemed to be a bit of a rogue photo in there. There's nothing going on between them. It's not like that. They're both happily married, but they were soulmates politically, let's put it that way. So Reagan, Gorbachev meet each other several times. The last one of these is not actually, the last couple of these are not actually Reagan, because George H.W. Bush has taken over. Daddy Bush, as I like to call him, because Baby Bush is George W. Bush, comes much later in 2000. But George H.W. Bush takes over from Reagan in 89. So here's a little bit more detail on each of the different summits where they meet, but I've got some more detail coming up for you in about 1 second. Hold it. So Geneva Summit in Geneva in Switzerland, they meet for the first time. They get on and have a good working relationship. They meet without advisors, which is not what normally happens. There's normally a bunch of guys who've all got their own agenda, and it was just mano a mano, one-on-one, and they came up with the Geneva Accord, which meant that they would speed up arms talks, abolish chemical weapons or work towards it, and talk about human rights. So they set up a second meeting in Reykjavik, Iceland. And this was after the explosion at Chernobyl. And Gorbachev said, "We will reduce nuclear weapons if you give up your SDI program." Even though he knew Reagan was never going to do that. They didn't make an agreement, formal agreement particularly, but they still realized that they got on. Although there's a little bit more needle there in that meeting, because Gorbachev said Reagan insistence on deploying SDI had frustrated and scuttled the opportunity for agreement. But he must have known that Reagan was never going to do that. In Washington, Gorbachev had accepted that they were not going to scrap SDI at this point, and that he would be better off disarming Russia, reducing spending weapons, and better relationship with the West. And so this one led to the INF Treaty. So it's really important, this one, that said both countries remove all land-based missiles with an intermediate range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. So you can see all these missile deployments and bases that were eliminated by that treaty. A little bit more detail there. I'm not going to read through that. But you can, if you pause it. Reagan described the INF as the realization of an impossible vision, and Gorbachev said it had the universal significance for mankind, and it was the first step towards an even more radical agreement on nuclear weapons. And extra details were agreed at the Moscow summit in '88. Then Gorbachev traveled back to the US and said he reduced the number of Warsaw Pact troops and stopped fighting in Afghanistan. And then Reagan doesn't get voted out. It's he's done 2 terms by this point, so he can't stand again. So it's his, I don't know if it's his vice president, I think it was, who takes over from him, George H.W. Bush. And whilst in Malta, there are no new agreements, it is at this that both sides think the Cold War ends. And Gorbachev said that he'd never start an actual war, hot war against USA, and Bush said there will be a lasting peace. So if you know some of the key details and the dates of these summits, Geneva, Reykjavik, where nothing really happened, then Washington led to the INF, extra details in Moscow, and then discussion about START agreements and the CFE agreement in 1990, limiting the amount of non-nuclear forces as well as nuclear forces, and then START in 1991 limited most nuclear weapons by about a third. Here is some more information about those. We have the impact of Gorbachev's new thinking on foreign policy, which is to bring an end to the Cold War. In the Soviet Union, it means that because of this openness, there is a whole range of enemies of communism that have been in jail that have been released. Books that had previously been banned were published, including Tintin in the Land of the Soviets. There is also some reforms, like free elections for local governments, where other parties could stand other than the communists. However, the impact of that, giving people a little bit of freedom, was that they wanted more. And that was like Gorbachev had shook up a cherryade bottle and taken the top off and couldn't then control it, and people wanted more, and he couldn't get the cherryade back in the bottle. So Glasnost was a two-edged sword. It had pros and cons, because it meant he was popular, but it meant people wanted more. Sorry for the delay. That time I'd got to plug my laptop in. It was running out of juice. So that wasn't Gorbachev's intention, but he wanted to strengthen communism, particularly in Russia, and he certainly not want to weaken it in Eastern Europe. He thought that reforming it would make it stronger. But he was wrong, because once he'd started it, just like in Russia, the ending of the Brezhnev Doctrine meant that countries who were communists gradually became not communist. And you can see there it happened in different countries at different times, just like they become communist in the salami tactics in the 1940s. They very quickly, though, became non-communist in around 88, 89. And so if you know a couple of examples of different countries and how they became non-communist, the Solidarity, we talked about them, a guy called Lech Walesa, and the president of Poland, being leader of Solidarity, because they were made legal and they won the elections after becoming a political party. So Poland became non-communist. In Hungary, they set up lots of non-communist parties and free elections promised. They took the fence down between them and Austria once they became non-communist, which meant that actually people in East Germany could go through Hungary, travel into Austria, and then get to West Germany, which meant that the partition between East and West Germany was redundant. And in Czechoslovakia, there was a Velvet Revolution, so-called, because there was no violence at all, really, there. It was a very soft revolution. The Bulgarian Communist President live on TV, and in Romania, that was the most silent one, because Ceausescu didn't want to give up, and it was murdering people, but then he himself was found guilty and executed. The trial was broadcast on TV, and his execution was almost broadcast on TV. You hear the gunshots in the background, you hear their voice, but actually see them get shot, which is probably for the best. That was a reenactment picture, but I'm not going to dwell on that. So then East Germany, which is probably the most tokenistic, talismanic communist country, particularly because of the Berlin Wall, which had been an emblem of communist capitalist division for years, since it was made in 1961. Germany weren't going to be left behind. There were demonstrations in East Germany. Gorbachev visited and said, I'm not going to get involved. Brexit doctrine is gone now. This is your problem. And then because people were going through Hungary, Austria into West Germany, it was only a matter of time before they brought the wall down. And the German government announced that they were going to let people go through the wall much more easily without visas and waiting lists and all that. And then they mistakenly announced that it could happen like that evening, and there was a massive rush, and the Berlin Wall came down. Again, Google it. Google David Hasselhoff singing on the Berlin Wall. It's quite a moment in Cold War history and pop history, not gonna lie. So the Warsaw Pact was then ended because it was the response to NATO saying that if one communist country was attacked, then the others would intervene to defend them, but now they're not communist countries, so there's no need for the Warsaw Pact is there. Plus, because of the Brezhnev doctrine, the Warsaw Pact was used to keep an eye on what its communist allies and satellite states were doing, and now Gorbachev ended the Brezhnev doctrine. He didn't really need to do that. So because of the revolutions in the late 80s and early 90s, the Warsaw Pact was formally dissolved by 1991. And once the end of the Warsaw Pact happened, the Iron Curtains disappeared. The Cold War is pretty much over. Those satellite states regained their independence. And that was bad news for Gorbachev because he hadn't been able to control what he'd started. A lot of communists were angry with him and blamed him for losing control of the buffer zone, the protection, and then his own Soviet countries. Remember, the ones that are part of the Soviet Union, not just the communist satellite states. They declared themselves independent of the Soviet Union in 1990. However, he did get the Nobel Peace Prize, so that was nice for him. There was a coup attempt to get rid of him. A gang of 8 hardline communists tried to take over the government, and they put him in house arrest in his summer house, his dacha. It didn't succeed because one Boris Yeltsin, the mayor of St. Petersburg, said, no, I'm not going to let you hardline communists take over. So he brought it down, but it made Gorbachev look pretty weak because he was a bystander in the whole thing. He returned, but was weaker. Yeltsin was a hero. And when Gorbachev tried to introduce new reforms for the other Soviet states like Georgia and Ukraine and those ones, they said, well, we want to be like Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, we want our independence. And they all declared it unilaterally without Russia's permission in 1991. So by Christmas Day 1991, Gorbachev said the USSR as a country is no longer a thing. They're all individual countries again. And he resigned on that day. So now, instead of having a leader of the Soviet Union, you need a president of Russia, and the first one is Boris Yeltsin. So that is it for the Cold War. Warsaw Pact's gone. The Soviet Union's gone. Most of the nuclear weapons have gone. So what caused it? Well, it all started really with the invasion of Afghanistan. You could argue without that, Russians wouldn't have been struggling for cash. They could have carried on spending money on nuclear weapons and keeping up with America, but they didn't because they invaded Afghanistan. But you could argue that actually with SDI and the amount of American spending, that the Russians would never have kept up with that, with their communist system of funding compared to the capitalist system of funding. And so the trick of pretending SDI is real and the commitment to the $1 trillion was the real reason, not Afghanistan. And that led to Gorbachev thinking in a new way and a less combative way. And then you could also argue it's poor living standards in those Soviet states and in the satellite states, that when it came to the crunch, and despite Gorbachev saying we're going to end the Brezhnev doctrine and we're going to have glasnost perestroika, if those people had been happy already and not poor and not starving, and he said that they wouldn't have necessarily pushed more, there wouldn't have been protests and marches and revolutions, and they would have stayed communists. But because they were having a bad time, as soon as Gorbachev took the top off, they were straight out the bottle. I'm mixing my metaphors badly here, but I don't know what else to do. Right, that is it though. I will see you next time for another revision session. For now, ta-ta!